Dr. Spalding, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. And we'd love it if you could just tell us your thoughts, maybe some opening comments on what our founders thought about how our nation should approach foreign policy.
Well, great, Kathy, thank you. And first, I want to say how great Constituting America is and all the work you've done. I love helping you whenever I can, and largely because I love history. I love the founding. I love the dynamics of it. And the discussion of foreign policy is actually a great topic, an interesting topic, and a topic I think we can learn a lot from, less about the particulars, what did Adams or Jefferson or Madison think about this particular piece of foreign policy, and more about how to think about something like foreign policy, which is, I think, how we should really start the conversation. I mean, the founders were divided on the particulars. I always like to tell my students, we study people like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and well, they really couldn't agree on much at all. You can imagine them disagreeing on what food to have, where to go for dinner, whatever it might be. They, should there be a bank? Should there be this or that? We always emphasize their disagreements, but there really is this underlying consensus, and that includes something like foreign policy. Today we oftentimes think of foreign policy in the divisions of idealists and realists, suggesting that the idea of kind of power in foreign policy and principle or ideals in the foreign policy are really contradictory. They're opposites. They don't get along with each other, and that a nation must be pursuing one or the other, and thus that's the kind of the eternal debate, if you will. What's interesting about the American founding, partially because it was over 200 years ago, but also just because of the nature of how they looked at politics, which is very different from the way we look at it today. They took a different approach to something like foreign policy. That is, I think, really instructive. Which is to say that they thought that prudence was the watchword, if you will. You recall that's a classical virtue, going back to Aristotle, but also in kind of the whole tradition of thinking. Prudence is the great virtue of politics and statesmanship, which really means that they held both to principles. They were, in a way, idealists, but they weren't kind of naive and pie in the sky idealists, but they held to those principles. But they were also extremely practical. They recognized the reality of the world, the necessities of national defense, and sometimes, in certain cases, using force to defend oneself in perhaps even in a war. That relationship between principles and practice is actually what prudence is. It's how do you relate those two things? How do you translate, if you will, one to the other? And a great example of that is actually in how they thought about their foreign policy. And indeed, looking at it that way is constructive for learning just about politics in general and about how the founders approached questions. And how do you distinguish these things? At the time of the American founding, of course, the nation was a very fledgling nation, weak, surrounded by hostile powers, not only England, which they had just fought a revolution against, but the French and the Spanish. Their choices were actually somewhat limited, which is to say that there's a practical dilemma they had. But the question is, how do they then look at it in light of their higher principles, without being kind of utopian, which they clearly weren't, but recognizing this reality? Well, I think you see this very clearly in two particular documents that I want to highlight in my opening comments here that are really classic presentations of this argument. One is the Declaration of Independence itself, which we associate with announcing our independence to the world. It's a statement of principles, but it's also in its way a foreign policy document. It was addressed to the King of England, but of course it was meant for the opinion of the world, and it was written as such. And the other great document is George Washington's farewell address, which kind of followed this old tradition in European history of the end of their tenure, monarchs, or in this case, a president, would give an address, giving their settled opinions about how to look to the future and how to think about those things. But those two documents are classic for us answering this question. I just want to kind of go through some points that come out of that. The Declaration, of course, just from the very beginning, starts by making reference to how we want to establish a separate and equal station with other countries. It's an appeal for independence, which has implications about what they mean by that. But it also talks about how there are different peoples in the world, and we are now an independent and a separate people from Great Britain. Our peopleness, if you will, our particular countries defined, on the other hand, by things which are said to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Universal principles. The idea of equality, all men being endowed with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, out of which arises consent. It's important to understand that the Declaration, actually, in its very workings, is both a statement of universal principles, but also for a particular country. These are the things that we hold to be self-evident, and it really is that blending of the two things right from the get-go. Governments exist to secure rights, and we set up government for our safety and happiness. Those are kind of the two realms. And safety was a term they used to mean security, defense, making sure we can maintain our sovereignty. And our happiness, of course, was a much larger term having to do with pursuing our happiness, our good, as we understand it in the Constitution. The farewell address really kind of lays all out even more and in more particulars. The farewell address is often associated with Washington's great warning, which is to be aware of permanent alliances, although we can abide by temporary alliances, he says. But we should be guided by our interests, meaning in particular nations have their own interests. But also that interest should be guided by justice. So again, it's a connection between a particular thing and a universal thing. And this means that we should have a generally benevolent foreign policy. We should be peaceful with other countries. Commerce is a good way to relate to other countries. We should support liberty whenever we can. But we need to keep in mind some of our obligations. One obligation is not to do things that put our own country at risk. We have an obligation to defend the people that are our citizens. We can't really dictate the outcomes for other countries. To say that we want our own to be our own people, to have other countries have our own separate equal station means we have an obligation to recognize that in other countries as well. We are sovereign, but so are other countries. And that's a certain moderation that encourages. And also it reminds us, the farewell address, my favorite phrase in that is actually towards the end, he says, what is our objective? Our objective actually is to have what he calls the command of our own fortunes. So, which is foreign policy is to somehow control one's own fate. To be a sovereign nation, an independent nation means to be able to control one's fate. And in our case, especially, that goes beyond foreign policy to have something to do with our setting up our own institutions, our constitutional government, our process of democratic deliberation through lawmaking. And so those are all a particular aspect and tied inherently to how he understands and laid out the principles of foreign policy. So I'll stop there, but I think this relationship between universal principles and particulars and how they relate to each other and how we then look at the world is looking at the foreign policy of the founders is a great way to introduce the topic generally, and they've actually got a lot to tell us about that.
Well, thank you. That was very helpful. And I love bringing the Declaration into it and George Washington's farewell address. And, with the Declaration, I've actually always thought of it as more a domestically oriented document, but you're right. I mean, it was definitely a statement to the world. And you mentioned national independence. What do you think the founders meant by national independence? How did they see that?
Well, I think great, great thing to think through. There's a practical way they thought about independence, which was we wanted to be independent of Great Britain. We were being ruled by a king and a parliament, which was declaring itself to be supreme. We wanted to rule ourselves or to be self-governing. So independence meant literally to break that bond. But I think it means so much more than that. What does it mean to be independent? Well, for one thing, it means to be not dependent. And so independence means we're not dependent upon another nation for, as Washington said, our fortunes. And by fortunes, he just didn't mean merely wealth. He meant our fortunes, our future, our own well-being. Independence really means all of those things, I think. I think they had a very robust sense of what independence meant. In the classic world, there was a phrase called self-sufficiency. You weren't truly independent until you were self-sufficient. You could take care of yourself. You could defend yourself. You could stand up for yourself. And then beyond that, you could do other things which had about your kind of national flourishing as citizens and a people in a self-governing republic. And I think they really had all those things in mind as they developed this idea.
And what were some of the debates between the founders? You mentioned some disagreements. Could you give us some examples of two of the founders whose views didn't exactly coincide with each other?
Well, they disagreed. They disagreed about so much. I mean, the most famous dispute, I think, really is between Hamilton and Jefferson. So Hamilton really favored being close to and strongly associated with Great Britain. Even after the American Revolution, Great Britain was the strongest country in the world, controlled the seas, and that would defend us. He also favored a strong national defense, building ships and preparing yourself for the possibility of war. Jefferson, on the other hand, he was a diplomat during the time of the American Revolution. Before he was president, he was the ambassador to France. He very much favored diplomacy, but also was more favored towards a close relationship with France. He thought France was intellectually more closer to how America should look at the world. And they, in the Washington administration, they're both in Washington's cabinet, and they fight. They, not physically, but I mean, they argue about this at great length. What strikes me is, and there were other disagreements about, well, what you do about Russia or the other European countries, or the Barbary pirates famously were messing around with our trade. We had to do something about that. But what strikes me is that despite those disagreements, there's this underlying agreement. And so often when we study it or we teach it or we look at it in classrooms, we emphasize their disagreements because that's kind of more fun to study because they argue with each other. But we shouldn't allow it to miss the real agreement. So for instance, Jefferson and Hamilton both deeply agreed that the beginnings of American independence were a claim that all men are created equal, that there were underlying natural rights underneath the whole meaning of American constitutionalism. And they also agreed that the thing to be defended was the American constitutional republic. Whether we should do it by being closer to the French or the British, those were kind of prudential, practical policy disagreements. And they had a healthy disagreement, and that was good, and we should. So disagreement does not necessarily mean disagreement about the more fundamental thing.
Well, I love that. That even though they disagreed, they still had the fundamental agreement on the founding principles. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Tova, who I am sure has got some great questions. And Tova, I'm going to let you take it away here.
Well, thank you so much. I think you gave a great overview of kind of the philosophy of our, international policy, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the structure of it. So, we have these institutions like the State Department or the CIA that are involved with international partners. So could you kind of give an overview of how those developed and kind of the unique role and philosophy behind each one?
Well, I mean, one thing to begin with is that there was no State Department. at the very beginning. If you recall, so the Constitution doesn't actually create any of these things. It implies them, but it wasn't until the first Congress where they actually created the first departments. The War Department, the State Department, the Office of the Attorney General. The State Department comes in, and it really is the Secretary of State and his immediate people working for him, which would mean mostly ambassadors around the country, around the world. It wasn't as extensive by any means. Indeed, the whole federal government wasn't extensive by any means compared to not only today, but what it was even 100 years ago. So the structure really was much more the relationship between the president and the Secretary of State and instructions that were given from them to ambassadors. Another thing to keep in mind was the extent to which the U.S. Senate was much more involved in a way than it is today. The Senate, of course, plays the role in confirming ambassadors, but also giving advice and consent for treaties. They took that role seriously. So the Senate was really a grounds for debating American foreign policy. The process and structure you're thinking of really developed very slowly over time as they became more and more necessary. Really, it's not until you get to the Civil War where there's actually an extensive War Department, for instance. Up until then, it was largely how do you deal with border issues and maybe a small navy, but nothing quite extensive. It really isn't until you get well past that into the 20th century, indeed World War I and World War II, that we start getting the more extensive apparatus of not only the State Department, but various aspects of national security that are formed to support that.
Okay, thank you. And then what you were mentioning about the legislature being very involved in foreign policy, that was something that didn't occur to me since it's kind of different from today. So I was curious from a constitutional perspective, why did the founders give kind of at least initially, the responsibility and the rights for the bulk of foreign policy decisions to the legislature and not necessarily the executive, which I don't know, in a lot of other countries, it seems that like the head of state takes on that role mostly.
Well, let me kind of explain it a little bit further. Part of that is, one reason why I love teaching history and thinking about it from that perspective is we see what's around us and we just assume that's the way it always was, and that clearly wasn't the case. So the Constitution creates the three branches of government, and here we're really talking about the executive and the legislature, and they each have separate vestings of power. And the executive has its own powers, as does the legislature. And when it comes to foreign affairs, when it comes to war powers, when it comes to security, the executive clearly takes the lead. They have the power from the Constitution's point of view. That was true from the very beginning. Having said that, the legislature, the lawmaking branch, played an extensive role in all of these things because not only do they have to budget these operations, but they had to oversee and have relationships with and do hearings and things. And so they naturally wanted to know, well, why do we need to build those 5 ships? Which at the time, that was a big deal. What are we going to do about these things? And so there was much more of a deliberative back and forth between the executive branch and the legislative branch than we have today. And that was also because the executive didn't have the extensive knowledge and administration or bureaucracy that exists today to rely on. And so they oftentimes would defer to or look to or go to, say, a senator or somebody who was extensively involved in these matters. So you think of someone like the great senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay. He was very much interested in foreign policy, was oftentimes involved. Many of the people who become Secretary of States became presidents in the early American history. So there was a lot of kind of fluidity, if you will, kind of a dynamic relationship, which I think actually was good, which meant that your legislators had a lot more knowledge about foreign policy, and your executive was more naturally working with legislators. but it is true. I don't mean to get the wrong impression. The executive really took the lead and was the national spokesman, and especially when it came to questions of security and relations with other countries. But they worked a lot more, I think, with the Synod especially.
Great, thank you so much. And then, nowadays America is kind of the leader or one of the biggest superpowers and leaders in foreign policy. We kind of talk about America as being the leader of the free world. But I was thinking that, when we were founded, that definitely wasn't the case. We were kind of a smaller country and then gained a lot of prominence. So I was curious, how our kind of philosophy and thinking about foreign policy changed when we were kind of a small new country, versus now when we gained power and became a superpower. How did our ideas about like our role in the world and our foreign policy change?
Yeah, that's a gosh, that's a great question. And one could take a whole course on that question. But I think I would answer it, this way, which is, one way to look at that is to look at the various stages and how these things changed over time, which from a historical point of view is absolutely crucial. So, really the America, almost from the beginning, is doing things in the world. We're having relations with other countries. We send over the Navy to deal with the Barbary pirates right at the beginning. But it's really not till, say, the Spanish-American War, and then you're getting into the post-Civil War era, the early 20th century, that the modern involvement really starts. But I guess I would emphasize that before we even get to that point, the more important thing to really have a handle on, what are the principles that should guide those circumstances? So, for instance, I emphasize this phrase from Washington that I like about the objective here is to establish the command of our own fortunes. Well, that means that all these other questions, how involved should we be in the world? How big should our Navy be? How concerned we should be about the making sure the Panama Canal is controlled by a neutral force? All those are prudential questions, which is to say that you make those decisions in light of something else. Well, what's the first thing we need to learn is what's the something else? And I would argue that despite the changes in our involvement, the ebb and flow of what we're doing in the world, the core principles always stay the same, which is our first obligation is to our own country. We have an obligation to respect the sovereignty of other countries. But having said that, right, we as John Quincy Adams once famously said, we don't go about the world looking for monsters to destroy. But on the other hand, if there are monsters that are trying to destroy us, we're going to be actively involved. Thinking all that through means knowing a lot about the particulars and the circumstances, but knowing first what are the things that drive us and what's most important to us, which is our constitutional system, our republic, protecting our own country and our citizens, preserving liberty here. But we're not oblivious to the world, and that all very much matters as we look out, at it and make those decisions.
Great, thank you so much. And then I was curious, I'm sure there's many different thoughts about this, but in terms of our general foreign policy ideas, do we believe that kind of all countries have to be like capitalistic and democratic like us? Or do we have that recognition? I think that you were kind of talking about earlier that like, as long as it doesn't directly affect us, countries can be however they want. And if so, kind of why have we seen a lot of like intervention by the US in other countries, such as like the Vietnam War and everything,
Right.
just kind of like that whole process.
Right. Another great question. And again, I'd probably say there are different kinds of different ways to think it through. Let me so one distinction I would make is between different types of regimes, right? There are a variety of regimes, and you go back to Aristotle and talks about this whole history of how do we categorize regimes. We are not oblivious to those distinctions. So to say that, well, another country can be as whatever it wants as long as it doesn't bother us, that's only true up to a point. From a national security point of view, yes, our primary interest, if you will, is countries that are threatening us. which means, immediately threatening. You're threatening to do something to us. We have to defend ourselves against them. We don't like those regimes. But having said that, we do recognize there are different types of regimes, and we should say things about it. So, for instance, we do believe, according to our principles, the Declaration is a universal statement of principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're going to build this great democratic republic at home. But gosh, we think that a democratic republic and human equality is the best principle and universally true. That doesn't obligate us to do something in every circumstance about it, but it doesn't mean we ignore and fail to recognize or say something about regimes that are doing cruel and inhumane things. So I make a distinction between our outward view of the world, which we should always talk about. We should try to spread our principles. We should uphold our principles. We should help people who are yearning to breathe free, as it says from the Statue of Liberty. But our priority really is what do we need to do to defend ourselves? Now, another aspect of your question here, and again, this is a very short answer to a much longer question. You raised about interventions. Well, I mentioned that interventions are prudential questions, but also, there are large kind of movements and historical events happening in the world which we can't ignore. So, for instance, you mentioned Vietnam, or I'm sure there's lots in that era to think about. Well, this is in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and there, you had a not only another nation, but a nation and a whole alliance of nations who are opposed to the United States and an alliance of nations. And there was this distinction between the quote unquote free world, which were made up of mostly various forms of democratic countries, and the communist world led by the Soviet Union and its kind of the satellite states around it. Well, that was a significant threat, not only to Europe immediately and directly, but to the United States. And there we had an obligation to think through how all of those relationships interacted. So it wasn't that we were intervening, say, in Korea or Vietnam just for the sake of Korea or Vietnam, although we were concerned about those peoples as well, but it really was an aspect of this larger confrontation. And here, another distinction Washington makes in the farewell address is between, he warns us about permanent alliances, but he says temporary alliances could be good for emergencies. You think of something like the NATO alliance, especially the NATO alliance, the classic NATO alliance, which was an alliance of democratic nations against the threat of the Warsaw Pact of the Soviet Union. That, I think, is very consistent with the American founders' understanding, because it was a defined threat, it was a defined purpose, and so it was kind of thought through and deliberated about how this would contribute to our own command of our own fortunes. So again, it's really this relationship between what are the principles that inform our foreign policy, and then what are really the particulars and the circumstances, and really knowing those that we come to some of these decisions, even though, as is great in this country, we very hotly and extensively debate them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then my final question, I've noticed, I've noticed it's a fact that, the US is kind of isolated geographically, like compared to Europe, where like a European country is surrounded by like all these shifting alliances and countries that could attack them and everything, as we see with Russia and Ukraine. Whereas the US is, we're kind of isolated. We have, Canada and Mexico, neither of which are like our enemies. They're both our allies. So I was curious how this kind of geographic isolation, and yet we still have like the largest military budget in the world, and we're definitely not, we're definitely involved in lots of conflict. So I'm curious how this geographic isolation of not having enemies at our border kind of impacts our foreign policy relative to maybe European or African or other countries that have conflicts more at their front door.
No, a good question as well. The United States is really in a providential situation, and the fact that we developed as colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America, separate from Europe, but also meaning we're also separate from the colonial overseer, England, was very providential to the development of our history. But having said that, I will note, I mean, this is why we study history, and history is important. The fact that today we have a friendly neighbor on our north and our south, and we're not surrounded by hostile powers, is largely because of the American founders and how they conducted and set us on a path of our foreign policy. Remember, after the American Revolution, right, the Spanish had a lot of Florida and a lot of southern aspects of the America. At one point, they controlled Mexico as well. Canada was a very active participant in English in Great Britain. The French controlled a lot of the Northeast. So the fact that we don't have those now does not necessarily mean that's always been the case. And one of the reasons why you want to command your own fortunes, again, to use Washington's phrase, is precisely so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you either have hostile powers around you, or you have powers around you that you can't predict or aren't friendly, or at least are, if not directly threatening, very unstable. So your environment does matter. Now, the question about, we have kind of become this great superpower. I think that also has a lot to do with kind of the other side of American foreign policy, which is the development of a market economy under a free constitution, and the development and the possibilities of entrepreneurial opportunity, and people can become things and build things and start businesses. That made the United States a very strong power economically. And part of that has to do with the decision, again, going back to the founders, that the best way to engage with the world is not to constantly fight wars with them, which was the old model. If you think about it, within the kings and how European history developed, right? It was a bunch of war. Our strategy, really, again, going back to our principles, is the better way to engage with the world is actually to be wary and be careful of people who threaten us. So know who our enemies are, but more generally, develop a lot of friends. And the way you develop friends is you trade with them. You have commerce. You have friendly relationships. And so as a result, the United States grew to be this great and powerful country that it is today. And yes, we still need to be careful about a hostile world. And in given modern technology, countries that are very far away, the oceans on either side are not necessarily things that can free us from the possible threats coming from hostile European or Asian powers. So we still have to be awake to all of those concerns as well.
Thank you so much for that overview. I know my questions aren't simple, so I appreciate you delving into it. And now I will pass on to thank you. I'll pass on to Jewel and Jordan.
Hi, Doctor. So this is obviously a big topic. So I have a kind of a big question, and then you can answer it however you will. With what's going on today, obviously with Russia and Ukraine, I've definitely been really bothered by the parallel drawn to the Iraqi war or Iraqi invasion, and it's for a number of reasons. But it harkens back to what you keep coming to as your principle, which is it is about principle, that these questions do derive from a certain philosophical belief or certain principle, and we can look at what the founders believed and then apply them and see if we are following that same philosophy or if the philosophy is different. So part of my question is coming from drawing a distinction between the situations, because what you will see currently right now is what a hot pop opinion is to say Americans are upset that Russia's invading Ukraine when America invaded Iraq or America invaded these other certain countries. Now, thinking about this, so here's now my question, which is not directly related to that, but it will get back to it eventually. So in your paper, which was a great compilation of so much information, so much you tied it all together. You didn't necessarily point out that you were arguing against any philosophy, but it was pretty clear that if you sat like in a college professor's room who disagreed with what you were saying, it was clear to see the distinction between the two ideas. This idea of sovereignty, to me, was probably home base. So the founders had this idea that man was sovereign in a way. He had sovereign rights. He had inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, so on and so forth. And everything else in our government came about from protecting these. Yet they also had then, therefore, from this idea that nations were sovereign, because there was part of that philosophy of that peoples had a right to the government that they saw fit for themselves. So America would almost be violating its own principle to impose democracy upon a people that didn't necessarily want it. And I even fell into just saying democracy when we're not a democracy, impose republicanism or whatever it is upon a people that don't want it. So although that's true, and although I have really nothing, I have no argument for any premise in your entire paper. I do have one question, assuming all of that and 100% agreement on all of that, and the concept of respecting sovereign borders. In the pursuit of respecting or protecting still the individual rights of man, when a nation would totally, completely violate in gruesome manner a large percentage of its population's right to life, like unleashing weapons on their own people, killing their own people, starving their own people. If you had the ability, while not putting your nation at risk at all, would you still have then the moral duty to protect even those other men's rights, being that as you say all men have rights despite whether they're in our country or not?
Right. There's a lot in that question, a lot to think through. I think I would approach it this way and make some distinctions here. You're right in going to this question of sovereignty. Of course, that's a lot is included in that term. What does it mean to be a sovereign nation? Which is actually not obvious all the time. Like, let's say some country declares its independence. At what point does it actually become sovereign in a way that we should recognize? There's a debate in that as well. Part of thinking about foreign policy is that there are many things that aren't completely clear, right? Because one distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy is in domestic policy, we kind of control our own terms of debate. We agree on the process, the lawmaking process, elections, these kinds of things. In the international world, there's constant a lot of agreement, but lots of disagreement all over the place. And some of these times, these terms aren't clear. So the operating principle, I think, of the West, if you want to think in broad terms, what I would argue really of most of the world is this notion of sovereign nationhood. I think the United States has a very robust sense of what that means, which goes back to its own kind of sense of constitutionalism and the lawmaking process and equality and the rule of law, which other nations don't necessarily have in the same way, but there's a sense of sovereignty. So, for instance, the distinction between or the point of Ukraine going on right now, and I'll be the first to point out that whenever I'm asked, well, what would the founders do about Ukraine? I never want to answer those questions because that's precisely not what they're good for. That's not what we learn from them. What they teach us how to think about things. Questions is what do we think about something like Ukraine? So it's not that they give us an answer, but having said that, I think the one clear distinction here is is Ukraine a sovereign country? Were they doing anything to threaten their neighbor? Were they going to war? Were they building up military to invade? And I think the answer there looks to me to be pretty much no. And so this does seem to be an example of, and the fact that there are so many people agreeing with the observation around the world, it seems to be a case where one sovereign nation is intervening in another sovereign nation for no reason, which suggests it must be either land or aggrandizement or something them pursuing their own interests. That seems to be, by the principles broad guideline, the founders' broad guidelines, an unjust thing to do. Now, having said that, here's the hard question for you to think through and figure out is, what do you do about it? Because you've got a lot of other obligations. You have an obligation to defend yourself. We have our alliances. We get involved and do things very reluctantly. It is not the way, we don't believe that it's the way to settle things, to immediately use force or go to war. So there's a lot of steps along the way. So I'm not sure there's a clear answer there to that first part of your question. But then your other question, I think, was about, well, what about in cases where there's a clear cry to do something, and we could, at no risk to our country, do something? Should we act to protect and do things? Is that right? There, I think there's still things we need to think through, which is it's rarely the case where there's no risk to our nation. At the very least, there's costs. And so one obligation we might have is that, well, we can't, one way to prevent bad things from happening in the world is essentially to run the world, to use our military to control the airspace everywhere in the world. Well, we're not going to do that. We shouldn't do that, because that would be extremely difficult and costly and probably cause all sorts of other problems. I think the founders' argument on that kind of question is, if there's a case where our interest and this good coincide, there might be there's an argument for doing things. The idea of indirectly helping allies or helping friends or helping people that want to move towards more Republican government, that want to get out from, say, a tyrannical government. Yes, we should look for ways to help them. We should support their cause. We should, if they want to help themselves, we should be willing to help them. But we should never forget that our obligation, indeed, I think an obligation for the cause of liberty, is making sure that we can also defend ourselves. So it's, I guess, my argument of the founders would be that they weren't in any form what they would call an isolationist, just kind of turning off the world and ignoring it and merely defending ourselves. That's clearly not their position. But on the other hand, they didn't want to involve themselves anywhere and everywhere at the drop of a hat. It's that balance somewhere in the middle, and there I think we're just obligated as a nation of citizens who, in our main job is to secure their rights, to think all these things through very carefully, prudentially. But yes, I do think we should support the cause of liberty. We should try to help people. We're a just and charitable people, but within reason. I think the founder there's nothing in principle why we would be opposed to doing those kinds of things in the world.
Thank you. My question is about the exact direction or guiding principle of those that are creating our foreign policy. In my mind, I would say that when our founders went about it, when we first created these policies, their obligation was to the American people. Not America, but the people. They believe that America was only some parts, it's the billions. And I want to know is that where you think your head should be when we either adjust these policies, create new policies, because it can be very different to have your greatest focus be the people or the nation. I think you can come out with very different answers.
Yeah, no, that's a good distinction, and I don't disagree with you. So I think when it comes to something like foreign policy, there is something called, we might call it the term the national interest. There's a nation, there's a country. I think you're absolutely right about that. When I talked about securing the rights of the people. I think these are kind of two terms which are actually in American political thought, in many ways, the same thing, right? So it doesn't mean that we are merely following the immediate opinions and passions of the people. As you yourselves were pointing out, it's not a democracy, it's a republic, it's representative. But having said that, it's important to understand that our national interest, which say the common good of America, the thing for which we are acting in the world, is for these particular institutions, which are ultimately based on a sense of the people being the sovereign, as opposed, say, to a king or an oligarch or whatever it might be. That is essentially what America is about. But you're absolutely right. Especially in foreign policy, it's about the common good. It's not merely what, if 51% think we should, go do this, run off and do this. It's more deliberative. You want to think these things through, it's just that the opinion of the American people is an element of our foreign policy, unlike a lot of other countries, and that's good. That's good because when you think of something like war, especially, it's the sons and daughters of American citizens who are going to be involved in the world when it comes down to that. So they should have a say in it. This is why declarations of war must come from the House of Representatives. This is why the Congress, especially the House of Representatives, the popular branch of the popular chamber, controls the budget, which is what pays for the military. So there's that keen relationship there that I think is very important. But you're absolutely right. It's really more ultimately, what is the national interest? What's the common good for which we act in the world? It's just that we always have to understand that our common good, our national interest, has something to do with preserving, securing this deeper understanding of rights and constitutionalism, rule of law, in which the people are sovereign. Keep in mind that in most countries in the world, if you think about Russia today, or China, or innumerable countries in Africa and Asia and other, right, the people have no say in what their countries do. And that's disastrous in many ways, because now foreign policy becomes kind of a plaything of a very small number of people. And that's a dangerous situation as well.
Hey, we probably have some great audience questions now.
Yes, thank you, Joel and Jorn. And Dr. Spalding, Tracy writes that George Washington, in his famous farewell address, said that we should have no entangling alliances. We've talked a little bit about, that George Washington talked about permanent alliances, but what do you think he had in mind? Were there specific alliances he was thinking of that made him advocate this, or what do you think his definition was of entangling alliances?
A great question. I'll make a technical distinction first, which I always like to point out, is that Washington talked about, he warned us against permanent alliances and said there could be temporary alliances. The phrase entangling alliances actually comes from Jefferson's inaugural. Washington didn't actually use the term. So he meant, I think, it made a kind of a finer distinction. At the time, what he meant was that we shouldn't permanently allow remember, there's this debate going on within his own administration between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton is more pro-British, Jefferson is more pro-French. But Washington says we should not have a permanent relationship with either of those countries. We should not tie ourselves to either country. Instead, we shouldn't think that way. We should think in terms of commanding our own fortunes, being independent. That's why he was against permanent alliances. But temporary alliances are fine. Now, and there he meant having a commercial relationship, having a treaty of friendship, which we had with the French during the American Revolution. We obviously developed close relationship with the British, later, and to this day, we have this special friendship. But they're not permanent. We're not obligated in the same way a permanent alliance would be. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier something like the NATO alliance. Well, the NATO alliance originally and today are quite different. And today, I think we have a discussion about what does the NATO alliance become. But at least in its original iteration, which was it was an alliance of nations more temporary to deal with an immediate threat from the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. I think Washington's farewell address would have seen that as a perfectly allowable alliance. It's a temporary alliance. It's for a particular purpose, a particular reason. But he would have shied away from permanent things which tie our hands in ways we can't know about in the future. I mean, part of having the independence of foreign policy is not tying yourself down, because you don't know what's going to happen next year or 5 years from now, let alone beyond that, in terms of what threats might come up, or what enemies might become friends and what friends might become enemies.
Well, great, thank you. And then Dennis asks about the War Powers Act, and actually we're going to be talking next week about war, and then the week after that we're going to be talking about treaties. I think we're flipping our episodes, but how did the War Powers Act change what the founders had envisioned?
Well, I'll give you a short answer, I suppose, since I know you're going to look at this again later. So when we say war powers, we are referring to the Constitution. And the Constitution, recall that each branch is vested with powers, and the president is vested with the executive power, which means executing the laws in most circumstances. But in certain cases, for instance, in the case of war, it also triggers other powers, which is the president has the power to direct the military and to conduct the war for the sake of defending the nation. The War Powers Act, which is in early 70s, you might correct me if I can't remember what exactly year it was, but it comes along in the 1970s. And what it is trying to do is come up with a more nuanced relationship between the executive and the legislature, because the problem is that at that point, the distinction between doing something for immediate national security and doing something which is the equivalent of war, which is a power that Congress has, declaring war, needed to be clarified, and they wrote something called the War Powers Act. Now, no president to date has recognized the War Powers Act. There's a question about its constitutionality because it limits the ability of the president to defend the country. So there's there's a very healthy debate there. I think in this case, the executive has the better argument. The Congress can exert that power, but it can do things through controlling budgets, making formal declarations of war or not. But the notion that somehow it should require the president to inform Congress within X number of days, this kind of thing, at a certain point that limits the powers of the president, the inherent constitutional powers of the president. But so I guess my short answer is the debate of the war powers does change how it operates, but I don't think that question has been settled in the modern era.
Well, thank you. And as I said, that's a great lead in to our episode for next week. So we want to invite everyone to come back next week, Tuesday at 2:00. We're going to be talking about various wars and engagements throughout our history and the Constitution. And we just want to thank you, Dr. Spalding, so much for being with us today. And we also want to thank Hillsdale. Hillsdale has just always been so helpful to us here at Constitute America in so many different ways. And you and I were talking earlier that we've had several of our We the Future contest winners who are both current and past Hillsdale students. So thank you for all the great work that you do. And Tova, would you like to say anything in parting?
Yeah, thank you so much for being on and answering our questions. It's so great to get an overview, especially with everything going on in the world right now. So thank you so much for your time.
And Jill and Jorn, would y'all like to say anything in closing?
Thank you very much. It was another great show. I really appreciate your depth of knowledge about the topic.
And thank you to all our audience members. And we hope to see you back next week, Tuesday at 2:00. So thank you.
Thank all of you too. Thank you, Kathy.